Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey, not to some far-off galaxy, but to a time that feels just as alien, the Middle Ages. As you lay there, your body cushioned by your bed, the soft glow of the moonlight slipping through the curtains, let your mind wander into the realm of history. Imagine a landscape dotted with grand castles, their stone walls standing tall against the backdrop of the sky. Picture villages of thatched roof cottages, their chimneys puffing out smoke. See the people, the nobles in their fine silks, the peasants in their simple clothes, the monks in their solemn robes. Hear the clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the lowing of cows, the bustle of the market. It was a time of both intense hardship and remarkable innovation, a time that has captivated the human imagination for centuries. This is the time of the Middle Ages, and tonight we will explore why you, a modern individual, would find it almost impossible to last a single day in this era. You probably wouldn't survive your first breakfast, let alone a full day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Middle Ages, also known as the medieval period, spanned from the 5th to the 15th century. It started with the fall of the Western Roman Empire and merged into the Renaissance and the Age of Discovery. To set the scene, visualize this. You've woken up not to your alarm, but to the crowing of a rooster or the distant tolling of a church bell. The air is cold, and there's no gentle hum of a central heating system kicking in. You're not reaching for a smartphone to check the weather, because weather apps don't exist, and frankly, neither does electricity. Life in this era was far from the romanticized version we often see in movies or read in books. It was, in fact, a period characterized by great struggle and adversity. The average life expectancy was around 30 years, and a vast majority of the populace lived in abject poverty. Sanitation was poor, disease was rampant, and the threat of war was an ever-present reality. One of the most striking differences between our time and the Middle Ages is the sheer lack of modern conveniences that we take for granted. Imagine a life without electricity, without running water, without central heating. In the winter, you would have to rely on a fireplace for heat, with the constant risk of the fire going out in the middle of the night. In the summer, there was no escape from the oppressive heat and the swarms of insects that came with it. You might think that the simple act of eating would be a respite from these hardships, but even this was fraught with difficulty. Food was often scarce and of poor quality. The diet of the average peasant was limited to bread, vegetables, and a little dairy. Meat was a luxury reserved for the wealthy, and even if you were lucky enough to get your hands on some, there were no refrigerators to keep it fresh. Food poisoning was a common occurrence and could easily prove fatal. Water, too, was not as readily available as it is today. Wells were the primary source of drinking water, but these were often contaminated. As a result, people frequently drank ale or beer, as the alcohol killed some of the harmful bacteria. However, this led to a whole other set of problems, as excessive drinking was common. This initial glimpse into medieval life barely scratches the surface of the discomforts and dangers you'd face. Historians still argue whether the widespread consumption of low-alcohol ale actually contributed more to hydration or to a constant state of mild inebriation among the populace. It's certainly a quirky tidbit to consider while you enjoy your filtered water. Hygiene was another area in which medieval times vastly differed from today. Bathing was not a daily or even weekly occurrence. In fact, it was widely believed that bathing opened the pores to disease, and so it was often avoided when possible. As a result, people often had lice, fleas, and other parasites. The sheer thought of constantly itching, feeling creatures crawling on you, is enough to make your skin crawl, isn't it? Imagine living with that reality day in and day out. The lack of dental care meant that tooth decay was rampant, and the solution, usually extraction without any form of anesthesia. Picture yourself in a medieval dentist's chair, which was probably just a stool, with someone coming at you with pliers. Yeah, not exactly a spa day. Medicine, too, was a far cry from what we know today. Doctors had a limited understanding of the human body and disease, and their treatments were often more harmful than helpful. Bloodletting was a common practice, based on the belief that it could balance the body's humors. This involved cutting a vein to literally drain blood, often leaving patients weaker and more susceptible to infection. Surgery was performed without anesthesia, and the mortality rate was extremely high. Even a simple cut could lead to a fatal infection due to the lack of sterile practices. Let's continue our journey through medieval times with a closer look at the living conditions. If you're fond of modern amenities like running water, electricity, or even just a comfortable bed, medieval times would have been a significant shock to your system. Houses during this era were usually made of a wooden frame filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of clay, straw, and animal dung. The roofs were thatched with straw, which provided a modicum of insulation. However, the walls were thin, and the homes lacked any real heating source, making winters bitterly cold. Fireplaces were a luxury that few could afford, so most people huddled around a central hearth for warmth. The smoke from this open fire had to escape from a hole in the roof, which meant that the interior of the home was often choked with smoke. Imagine trying to find comfort in such a setting, huddled with your family members, your eyes stinging from the smoke. Most homes consisted of a single room that served multiple purposes. The same room that was used for cooking and eating was also the sleeping quarters. Privacy was a concept virtually unheard of, as entire families would sleep together in the same space, often on a single bed of straw. If you found the idea of sharing a bedroom with a sibling frustrating as a child, imagine sharing a bed with your entire family. Historians still debate the exact reasons for the widespread belief that bathing was unhealthy. Was it purely a medical misconception? Or did it also stem from religious or cultural practices of the time? This quirky tidbit highlights how different their reasoning was from ours. Sanitation, or rather the sheer lack of it, would be another massive shock to the modern system. There were no bathrooms as we know them. Instead, people would use chamber pots, which were then emptied out of windows and onto the streets below. The waste would then run down the streets and into the local rivers, which were also the primary sources of drinking water. The result was rampant disease, from dysentery to the plague. The smell alone would be enough to make the strongest stomachs churn. This brings us to the topic of personal hygiene. The idea of daily showers would have been unimaginable to the people of the Middle Ages. Most people bathed rarely, and when they did, it was often in the local river or a community bathhouse. These bathhouses, while providing a place for communal bathing, were also a breeding ground for bacteria and disease. There was a prevalent belief during this time that bathing opened the pores to disease. So many people chose to bathe as infrequently as possible. This meant that people often carried a strong odor, which was only masked by the use of herbs and flowers. Imagine trying to mask a pervasive body odor with a handful of wildflowers. It gives a new meaning to natural fragrance, doesn't it? Food in the Middle Ages was also a far cry from what we're accustomed to today. The average person's diet consisted primarily of bread, cheese, and ale. Meat was a luxury that few could afford, and fresh fruits and vegetables were not a common part of the diet. Malnutrition was a common problem, as the diet lacked many essential vitamins and nutrients. You might find yourself constantly feeling tired, your body aching from nutrient deficiencies you didn't even know existed. One quirky tidbit: some historians suggest that medieval peasants, despite their seemingly meager diet, might have consumed more calories than the average modern person due to the sheer physical demands of their labor. However, these calories often came from less diverse and less nutritious sources. It wasn't all hardship and struggle, however. There were moments of joy and celebration, often centered around religious holidays and feasts. Music and dance were important parts of medieval culture, providing a much-needed escape from the harsh realities of daily life. People would gather in the village square to dance, sing, and celebrate. Even in the darkest times, the human spirit finds ways to shine through. So, as we close this chapter, take a moment to appreciate the comforts of modern life. The next time you take a hot shower, sleep in a warm bed, or enjoy a fresh, healthy meal, remember how far we've come. The Middle Ages may have been a time of great cultural and intellectual growth, but they were also a time of hardship and struggle. It's a testament to the resilience of the human spirit that we've come so far. Historians still argue whether the perceived simplicity of medieval entertainment was a genuine reflection of contentment, or merely a limited set of options born from necessity. As the sun creeps over the horizon, our medieval day begins. Life in the Middle Ages was dictated by the sun. It determined when you woke, when you worked, and when you slept. In a world without electricity, daylight was precious, and every ray of sun had to be used for vital chores and tasks. If you're imagining the luxury of a lazy Sunday morning, think again. The medieval folk were early risers, typically getting up at the crack of dawn, as signaled by the crowing of a rooster or the tolling of the local church bell. Once out of bed, people would dress in simple tunics made of coarse wool, linen, or hemp, depending on their wealth and status. The wealthy might have clothes dyed in brighter colors and made of finer materials, but the majority wore drab, practical clothing, not unlike the sackcloth of biblical fame. Shoes were a luxury, with most peasants going barefoot, especially in the warmer months. The first meal of the day was breakfast, but this was not the feast of bacon, eggs, and toast that we're accustomed to. Medieval breakfast was a frugal affair, often consisting of a chunk of bread, some cheese, and if they were lucky, a bit of cold meat or fish from the previous night's meal. This would be washed down with a mug of ale, or for the wealthier folk, wine. Yes, you heard that right. Water was often unsafe to drink due to poor sanitation, so low-alcohol ale and wine were common beverages, even for children. After breakfast, it was straight to work. The majority of medieval people were peasants, working the land for the local lord. Their days were filled with hard physical labor, plowing fields, sowing seeds, tending animals, and harvesting crops. Even children were expected to contribute, with tasks appropriate to their age and strength. The work was backbreaking, and the hours were long, from dawn until dusk. The fields and pastures were a hive of activity, with only a short break at midday for a meal and rest. Imagine yourself bent over in a field, the sun beating down, your muscles aching, knowing you have hours more of the same work ahead of you. No air-conditioned tractors, no powered tools, just raw human effort. It's a stark contrast to a typical Monday morning commute, isn't it? One scholarly debate revolves around the exact nutritional content of the medieval peasant diet. While it seems meager to us, some historians argue that it was often sufficient for the high energy demands of their daily labor, provided harvests were good. If you were lucky enough to be a craftsman, your day might involve working in a shop or at a market stall selling your wares. Blacksmiths, bakers, carpenters, and weavers were all critical to the medieval economy. Their skills were in high demand, and their products, horseshoes, bread, furniture, and cloth, were essential for daily life. However, these jobs were not without their hardships. The work was often dangerous, with the risk of injury or even death from accidents or fires. Think of a blacksmith shaping hot metal, sparks flying in a dimly lit, smoky workshop, or a carpenter working with crude tools, risking a misstep that could cost them a finger or worse. A quirky tidbit is that many crafts were organized into guilds, which were powerful associations that regulated training, quality, and prices, and also provided a form of social and financial support for their members. In contrast, the life of a noble or a knight was very different. They did not labor in the fields, but they were busy with their own duties and responsibilities. They had to manage their estates, administer justice, train for war, and engage in politics. The noble's day was filled with meetings, decisions, and paperwork, much like a modern CEO. While they didn't break their backs in the fields, their lives were often fraught with political intrigue, the pressures of maintaining social order, and the constant threat of warfare. Imagine the stress of managing a large estate, making sure your peasants produced enough, while also navigating complex alliances and rivalries with other lords. It wasn't all feasting and jousting, although those certainly had their place. As the sun began to set, the day's work would come to an end. Supper was the main meal of the day, usually consisting of a hearty stew made of meat, vegetables, and grains. The wealthier you were, the more varied and extravagant your diet would be. The rich feasted on roasted meats, exotic spices, and sweet pastries, washed down with fine wines. After supper, people would gather around the hearth for a few hours of relaxation before bed. They might tell stories, play simple games, or just enjoy the warmth and companionship of their family and friends. It's a reminder that even without Netflix or video games, human connection and simple pleasures were still deeply valued. Then, as the last embers in the hearth died out, it was time for bed. Beds were simple affairs, often just a pile of straw covered with a blanket. Only the wealthy had the luxury of a wooden bedstead, a stuffed mattress, and feather pillows. As you lay down to sleep, you would be acutely aware of the silence, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant howl of a wolf. There were no hum of refrigerators, no distant traffic noise, no glow of streetlights seeping through the curtains. Just profound, natural darkness and the sounds of the night, which, for a modern person, might feel eerily quiet or unsettlingly loud, depending on your perspective. This deep connection to natural cycles, a mainstream historical fact, defined much of medieval life. The feudal system was the bedrock of medieval society, a complex hierarchy that dictated almost every aspect of a person's life. At the very top was the king, who owned all the land. He would grant large tracts of land, known as fiefs, to his most powerful nobles in exchange for their loyalty, military service, and financial support. These nobles, in turn, would subdivide their land and grant it to knights, who pledged to protect them and their lands. At the bottom of this pyramid were the vast majority of the population, the peasants, also known as serfs. They were tied to the land and worked it for the Lord, in exchange for protection and a place to live. They were not slaves in the strict sense, as they could not be bought or sold, but they were not free to leave the land without the Lord's permission. Their lives were harsh, dominated by labor and obligation. Imagine being born into a system where your destiny was largely predetermined by your birth, where your daily existence was a perpetual cycle of work for someone else's benefit, with very little hope of upward mobility. This rigid social structure, while seemingly unfair to us, provided a form of stability in a world often beset by chaos. A quirky tidbit is that while serfs were bound to the land, their lords also had obligations to them, such as providing protection and a degree of justice, creating a complex web of reciprocal duties. Historians still argue about the precise degree of freedom, or lack thereof, enjoyed by different classes of serfs across medieval Europe. The role of the Church during the Middle Ages was immense, permeating every facet of life. It was not just a religious institution. It was a powerful political, social, and economic force. The Church owned vast amounts of land and wielded significant influence over kings and nobles. It provided a moral framework for society, dictating behavior and beliefs. For the common person, the Church was the center of their spiritual and often their social life. Services were held daily, and religious holidays were major events, offering rare breaks from labor and opportunities for community gathering. The Church also played a crucial role in education, preserving knowledge and providing what little medical care was available. Monasteries were centers of learning, where monks painstakingly copied manuscripts, keeping ancient knowledge alive during a period when literacy was rare outside the clergy. Imagine a world where your worldview, your understanding of right and wrong, and even your daily schedule were profoundly shaped by the pronouncements of the Church. It offered hope and solace in a difficult world, but also exerted considerable control. This pervasive influence of the Church is a mainstream historical fact that cannot be overstated. Education and knowledge during the Middle Ages were remarkably different from our modern systems. For the vast majority of the population, formal education simply did not exist. Most people, especially peasants, were illiterate and learned what they needed to know through practical experience and oral tradition. Knowledge was passed down from generation to generation through apprenticeships for crafts, or by simply observing and participating in daily farming tasks. Imagine growing up in a world where books were rare, hand-copied luxuries, and where the ability to read and write was a specialized skill. not a universal expectation. This fundamental lack of widespread literacy is a mainstream historical fact. However, centers of learning did exist, primarily within monasteries and cathedrals. These institutions served as the custodians of knowledge, preserving classical texts and developing new theological and philosophical ideas. Monks painstakingly copied manuscripts, often beautifully illuminated, ensuring that ancient wisdom wasn't lost. Universities began to emerge in the later Middle Ages, particularly in cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford, offering studies in theology, law, and medicine. These early universities were quite different from their modern counterparts. Lectures were delivered orally, and students often lived in rudimentary conditions. A quirky tidbit is that students at these early universities would often travel great distances, sometimes begging along the way, to attend lectures from famous scholars, a testament to their hunger for knowledge. Historians still argue about the true accessibility of these early universities and whether they genuinely offered pathways for social mobility or primarily served the already privileged classes. Warfare and defense were ever-present realities in the Middle Ages, shaping landscapes and daily lives. The constant threat of conflict meant that castles were not just impressive architectural feats, but vital defensive structures. These formidable stone fortresses, with their thick walls, moats, and drawbridges, were designed to withstand sieges and protect the lord and his people. Life within a castle during a siege would have been incredibly stressful and uncomfortable, with cramped conditions, limited food, and the constant danger of attack. Outside the castles, smaller villages often had palisades or earthen ramparts for protection, but they were far more vulnerable. Knights, as part of the feudal system, were professional soldiers, trained from a young age in combat, horsemanship, and chivalry. Their primary role was to fight for their lord, whether defending his lands or campaigning against rivals. Imagine the constant readiness for battle, the clanking of armor, the drills and exercises, all a routine part of life. Battles themselves were often brutal and chaotic affairs, fought with swords, spears, axes, and bows. There was no concept of Geneva Conventions or regulated warfare. Combat was often highly personal and deadly. The longbow, a mainstream historical fact, emerged as a particularly devastating weapon in the later Middle Ages, capable of piercing armor from a distance and changing the dynamics of battlefield engagements. However, alongside the grand battles and sieges, there was also a pervasive sense of localized conflict, with raids and skirmishes being a common occurrence between rival lords or even neighboring villages. A quirky tidbit is the use of siege engines like trebuchets and catapults, which were essentially giant machines designed to hurl massive stones or even diseased carcasses over castle walls to spread terror and illness among the defenders. Historians still argue about the true effectiveness of siege warfare in the early Middle Ages, with some suggesting that many sieges were more about starving out defenders than outright breaching walls. This continuous state of military preparedness and conflict meant that life was precarious, and death could come unexpectedly from many quarters, not just disease or starvation. Beyond the grand spectacles of castle sieges and nightly battles, the constant low-level threat of violence was a mundane aspect of medieval life that you would quickly become accustomed to, or perhaps tragically fall victim to. Outlaws roamed the forests, bandits plagued trade routes, and local disputes could easily escalate into violent skirmishes between families or small communities. There was no professional police force as we understand it, and justice, while theoretically administered by the Lord, could be slow, arbitrary, and often brutal. Punishments for crimes were often public and severe, ranging from flogging and mutilation to execution, serving as stark deterrents. Imagine the fear of traveling alone, knowing that lurking around the next bend could be danger, with little recourse for immediate protection. This precarious state of personal security is a mainstream historical fact, contrasting sharply with the relative safety many of us enjoy today. A quirky tidbit is the concept of benefit of clergy, where literate individuals accused of crimes could sometimes appeal to be tried by an ecclesiastical court rather than a secular one, often resulting in more lenient sentences. Historians still argue about how frequently this privilege was abused and its overall impact on medieval justice systems. The economy of the Middle Ages was predominantly agrarian, meaning it was based almost entirely on farming. Land was the primary source of wealth and power, and the vast majority of the population worked the land. The manorial system, where peasants worked on a lord's estate, was the backbone of this economy. Peasants would pay rent to the lord, often in the form of labor, a portion of their crops, or sometimes even money. Trade did exist, but it was often localized and conducted at markets or fairs. Long-distance trade was risky and expensive, limited by poor roads, banditry, and slow transportation. Major cities, however, did develop into important centers of commerce, attracting merchants and craftsmen. Imagine a world where your entire livelihood, your very survival, depended directly on the success of the harvest. A bad crop year could mean starvation for an entire village. This direct link between land, labor, and survival is a fundamental aspect of medieval economics. Technological innovation, while perhaps not as rapid as in our modern era, was nonetheless significant during the Middle Ages. Important advancements were made in agriculture, such as the heavy plow, which allowed for more efficient cultivation of fertile but heavy soils, and the three-field system of crop rotation, which increased agricultural output and reduced the risk of famine. These innovations, while seemingly simple, had a profound impact on population growth and the development of medieval society. In warfare, as mentioned, the longbow and later gunpowder weapons began to change the face of battle. In construction, architectural advancements led to the soaring cathedrals and intricate castles that still stand today, demonstrating remarkable engineering skill. A quirky tidbit is the invention of eyeglasses in 13th century Italy, which revolutionized reading and scholarship, extending the productive lives of many intellectuals. Historians still argue about the true pace of technological progress in the Middle Ages, with some scholars emphasizing periods of significant innovation that are often overlooked in the popular imagination. Life for women in the Middle Ages varied greatly depending on their social status. For peasant women, life was a relentless cycle of hard labor, both in the fields and in the home. They worked alongside men, tending crops, raising livestock, and managing the household, which included cooking, cleaning, child-rearing, and often producing textiles. Noblewomen, while spared the physical labor, had their own responsibilities, managing large households, overseeing servants, and often administering estates when their husbands were away at war or court. Marriage was primarily an economic or political alliance rather than a romantic union, particularly among the nobility. Childbirth was incredibly dangerous, with high mortality rates for both mother and child. Imagine the constant fear of losing a loved one or your own life during this incredibly vulnerable process. Despite these challenges, women often held significant influence within their domestic spheres, and sometimes even in broader society, especially through religious orders or as regents. This complex tapestry of women's roles is a mainstream historical fact. Childhood in the Middle Ages was a period of rapid transition, often much shorter than what we consider childhood today. Children were generally seen as miniature adults and were expected to contribute to the household and family economy from a very young age. Play, while present, was often integrated with practical learning. For peasant children, this meant helping in the fields, fetching water, or tending to smaller animals. For noble children, education involved training in knightly skills for boys, or household management, and social graces for girls. Infant mortality rates were shockingly high, a grim mainstream historical fact, meaning that many parents would experience the profound sorrow of losing multiple children. Imagine the emotional toll of such constant loss, living in a world where the survival of your offspring was far from guaranteed. This pervasive reality deeply shaped family dynamics and emotional resilience. A quirky tidbit is the existence of toys like dolls, wooden animals, and miniature weapons, suggesting that even amidst hardship, there was a universal impulse for play and imagination. Historians still argue about the precise age at which children were considered adults in different medieval societies, as it varied significantly across regions and social classes. The concept of time itself was experienced differently in the Middle Ages. Without precise mechanical clocks until the later centuries, time was often measured by natural rhythms, the rising and setting of the sun, the changing seasons, and the tolling of church bells for prayer times. Agricultural cycles dictated the flow of the year, with specific periods for plowing, sowing, and harvesting. Imagine living a life guided by the sun's position and the sound of a bell, rather than the relentless ticking of a clock or the glow of a digital display. This more organic relationship with time, while perhaps less efficient by modern standards, might have fostered a deeper connection to nature and a different sense of presence. This fundamental difference in time perception is a mainstream historical fact. Travel in the Middle Ages was arduous and dangerous. Roads were often poorly maintained, little more than dirt tracks that turned to mud in the rain. Bridges were scarce, and river crossings could be perilous. Travel by horse or on foot was slow, and journeys of even a few dozen miles could take days. Inns along the way were often rudimentary, offering little comfort or safety. Bandits were a constant threat, making solitary travel particularly risky. Imagine embarking on a journey where every mile presented a new challenge, where a simple trip to the next town could feel like an epic adventure, fraught with uncertainty. Despite these difficulties, people did travel for trade, pilgrimages, and warfare, linking different parts of Europe. A quirky tidbit is the use of roadside crosses or wayside shrines, which provided spiritual comfort and marked important routes for pilgrims and travelers. Historians still argue about the true volume of long-distance trade during the early medieval period, with some suggesting it was more extensive than traditionally thought. Daily dress in the Middle Ages reflected both social status and practicality. As you heard earlier, peasants wore simple tunics made of coarse wool, linen, or hemp. These garments were designed for durability and ease of movement during physical labor. Colors were often drab, derived from natural dyes, and clothing was mended repeatedly until it fell apart. The wealthy, however, flaunted their status with garments made from finer materials like silk and adorned with brighter, more expensive dyes. Imagine the social cues communicated purely through clothing, a peasant's simple brown tunic versus a noble's vibrant red or blue silk gown. Layering was common, as homes lacked central heating, making warmth a constant concern, particularly in the bitter winters. Shoes were a luxury for many peasants, who often went barefoot, especially during warmer months. This functional and status-driven approach to clothing is a mainstream historical fact. The simple act of getting dressed would have been a daily reminder of your place in society. Imagine pulling on that rough wool tunic, feeling its texture against your skin, knowing that this garment would be your everyday uniform, worn until it literally fell apart. And if you were a peasant, you likely didn't have many changes of clothes, meaning that same rough garment would stay with you for days, weeks, perhaps even months between washes. The concept of a fresh outfit for every day of the week, or even a different one for sleeping, was utterly alien. This mundane detail paints a vivid picture of the sheer practicality and scarcity that governed medieval life. Public health as a concept was virtually non-existent in the Middle Ages. The understanding of disease was rooted in theories of humors or divine punishment, not germs or contagion. As a result, measures to prevent the spread of illness were largely ineffective, or in some cases, even counterproductive, like the belief that bathing opened pores to disease. This lack of scientific understanding meant that plagues and epidemics, like the infamous Black Death, could sweep through populations with devastating speed and mortality. Imagine living in a time when a cough or a fever could quickly escalate into a death sentence, and the best doctors had remedies like bloodletting, which often weakened the patient further. The sheer vulnerability to illness is a mainstream historical fact that deeply colored the medieval experience. A quirky tidbit is the use of plague doctors in later medieval periods, who wore distinctive beak-like masks filled with aromatic herbs, believing this would ward off the bad air causing the disease. Historians still argue about the extent to which medieval public health measures, crude as they were, might have actually helped or hindered disease containment. Religious life was deeply interwoven with the fabric of medieval society, influencing not just spiritual matters, but also politics, law, and daily routines. The church's calendar dictated the rhythm of the year, with numerous feast days, fasts, and religious festivals providing breaks from labor and opportunities for communal celebration. These occasions were often the only source of widespread entertainment and social gathering for the common people. Imagine your entire year being structured around religious observances, with specific foods eaten or avoided on certain days, and special rituals marking the changing seasons. The church also provided a sense of community and support, particularly for the poor and sick, through charities and monastic orders. This pervasive influence of religious belief and institution is a mainstream historical fact. Food preservation techniques were rudimentary, making the availability of fresh food highly seasonal. Without refrigeration, people relied on methods like salting, smoking, drying, and pickling to preserve meat, fish, and vegetables for the leaner months. Imagine the taste and texture of your food being dominated by salt or smoke, and the limited variety available outside of harvest seasons. This constant struggle against spoilage meant that food poisoning was a regular threat, and even seemingly simple meals could carry deadly risks. Meat as you know, was a luxury for the wealthy and not stored fresh. Grains, primarily barley, oats, and rye, formed the staple of the peasant diet, often consumed as bread or pottage. A quirky tidbit is the elaborate nature of noble feasts, where not only was there a vast quantity of exotic and roasted meats, but dishes were often presented with theatrical flair, sometimes even involving live animals or elaborate food sculptures. Historians still argue about the true nutritional value of the medieval diet for different social classes, and whether malnourishment was a constant struggle or primarily an issue during times of famine. The constant threat of famine was a grim reality. Unlike today, where global supply chains can often mitigate local crop failures, medieval communities were largely self-sufficient. A bad harvest due to poor weather, pests, or disease could lead directly to widespread starvation. This vulnerability meant that life was lived on the edge, with prosperity often just one bad season away from destitution. Imagine the anxiety that would permeate every aspect of life. The constant worry about whether there would be enough food to survive the winter. This deeply ingrained fear of scarcity is a mainstream historical fact. It puts into perspective the abundance we often take for granted. Leisure and entertainment, though simple by modern standards, were cherished moments in medieval life. Beyond religious festivals, storytelling was a popular pastime, with bards and minstrels traveling from village to village, sharing tales of heroic knights, mythical beasts, and ancient legends. Feasts, especially for the nobility, were elaborate affairs with music, dancing, and theatrical performances. For the common folk, simple games, wrestling, and communal singing and dancing in the village square provided much-needed diversion from the daily grind. These shared cultural activities fostered community bonds and offered a vital emotional release. A quirky tidbit is the popularity of chess, which arrived in Europe from the Middle East and quickly became a favorite pastime among the nobility and educated classes. Historians still argue about the extent to which these forms of entertainment truly transcended social barriers, or if they merely reinforced class distinctions. The village was the primary unit of social organization for the vast majority of medieval people. It was a close-knit community where everyone knew everyone else, and life revolved around shared labor, mutual support, and communal events. The church, the mill, and the local tavern were often the central gathering places. Imagine living in a community where your entire world, from birth to death, revolved around a few hundred people, where your reputation and relationships were paramount. This intense communal living, while offering security, also meant a lack of privacy and social mobility. It was a world where individual identity was often subsumed by the collective. This fundamental structure of village life is a mainstream historical fact. Superstition and folk beliefs played a significant role in medieval life, existing alongside and often intertwining with official Christian doctrine. People looked for signs and omens in nature, attributed illnesses to curses or evil spirits, and believed in the power of charms and amulets to ward off misfortune. Magic, whether white or black, was often considered a real force. Imagine a world where unexplained events were quickly attributed to supernatural causes, where a sudden illness might lead you to seek out a local wise woman or a priest for spiritual intervention rather than a doctor. This pervasive belief in the supernatural is a quirky tidbit that sometimes gets overlooked in favor of purely religious interpretations of the era. Historians still argue about the precise boundaries between official church teachings and popular folk beliefs in medieval society, and how much the two influenced each other. The absence of widespread literacy meant that oral tradition was incredibly important. News, stories, laws, and even history were often passed down by word of mouth from one generation to the next. This made skilled storytellers highly valued members of the community. Imagine a world where your access to information wasn't through scrolling on a screen or reading a newspaper, but through listening to tales told by elders or wandering minstrels. It created a different kind of memory and a different way of understanding the world. This reliance on oral transmission is a mainstream historical fact. The power of reputation was paramount in medieval society. In a close-knit community where everyone knew your business, your honor, your word, and your family's standing were incredibly important. There was no anonymity, and a stain on your reputation could have far-reaching consequences, affecting your ability to trade, find a spouse, or even just be treated with respect. Imagine living in a world where gossip and rumor could profoundly impact your life, and where a good name was often your most valuable asset. This social pressure to conform and maintain a good standing is a mainstream historical fact. Even the experience of color was different in the Middle Ages. Dyes were derived from natural sources, plants, minerals, even insects, which often produced more muted or earthy tones compared to the vibrant synthetic colors we see today. Certain colors were expensive to produce, making them symbols of wealth and status. For instance, deep purples and blues were often reserved for royalty and high-ranking nobles because of the rarity of the dyes. Imagine a world where the palette was less expansive, where greens and browns dominated the landscape and common clothing, and where a splash of bright red or blue truly stood out. This limited color spectrum and its association with social status is a quirky tidbit that adds another layer to visualizing medieval life. Historians still argue about the precise shade ranges and fastness of medieval dyes and how they appeared under natural light. The concept of beauty and aesthetics also differed significantly. What was considered beautiful in art and fashion often reflected religious themes, social hierarchies, and practical considerations. Think of the elongated, stylized figures in medieval religious art, or the practical, layered clothing designed for warmth and durability. Beauty was often more about symbolism and function than what we might consider purely aesthetic appeal today. Imagine the sculptures and stained glass windows of cathedrals, designed not just to be beautiful, but to convey complex theological narratives to a largely illiterate populace. This illustrative approach to art is a mainstream historical fact. Waste management, or rather the lack thereof, would be a constant assault on your senses. As mentioned, chamber pots were emptied onto the streets, and animal waste was common, leading to a pervasive stench. There were no public waste collection systems. Organic waste, like food scraps, might be fed to animals or simply thrown outside where it would decompose. Non-organic waste would accumulate, contributing to the general squalor. Imagine the constant, heavy odor of refuse, animal dung, and stagnant water pervading the air, a scent that would become a constant companion in your daily life. This profoundly unsanitary environment is a mainstream historical fact, directly contributing to the rampant diseases of the era. A quirky tidbit, if it can be called that, is the existence of gong farmers in later medieval towns. Individuals whose unenviable job was to empty cesspits, often working at night to avoid the stench and public gaze. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of early municipal attempts to regulate waste disposal, and whether they had any significant impact on public health. The presence of animals was far more intimate and pervasive than in modern life. Livestock, like cows, pigs, and chickens, were often kept in or very near living quarters, providing food, labor, and warmth. Dogs were working animals, not just pets, used for hunting, herding, and guarding. Cats were valued for pest control. Imagine the constant sounds, smells, and physical presence of animals in your immediate environment, an integral part of your household and daily routine. This close proximity to animals and the symbiotic relationship with them is a mainstream historical fact that highlights the difference in living conditions. You would also quickly realize that the pace of life was fundamentally slower. There was no instant gratification, no immediate answers. Tasks that we complete in minutes today, like sending a message across town, might have taken hours or even days in the Middle Ages. Communication was slow, relying on messengers, whether on foot or horseback. Information spread at the speed of a horse's gallop or a traveler's stride. Imagine the patience required to live in such a world, where waiting was a constant, inherent part of existence. This slow pace of communication and life is a mainstream historical fact, contrasting sharply with our hyperconnected reality. The concept of a work-life balance was, of course, utterly alien for the vast majority. Life was work, punctuated only by sleep, meals, and religious observances. Even leisure activities were often communal and practical, tied to the rhythms of the village and the seasons. There was no clocking out or separating your personal life from your professional life, because for many, the home was also the workplace, and the family was the labor unit. This constant intertwining of life and labor is a mainstream historical fact. Even the experience of sound would be profoundly different. Without the constant hum of electricity, cars, and machinery, the world would have been dominated by natural sounds. The wind, the rain, the rustling of leaves, the calls of birds and animals. Human sounds, the clang of a blacksmith, the distant chatter of a market, the church bells, would stand out more distinctly. Imagine the quietness of the nights, broken only by the chirping of crickets, the hoot of an owl, or perhaps the nervous creak of your own house. This deep, natural soundscape is a quirky tidbit to consider, a stark contrast to the cacophony of modern urban environments. Historians still argue about the precise noise levels in medieval cities, as some sources suggest them to be surprisingly loud and bustling, particularly during market days. The role of light, or the lack thereof, would also shape your existence. Daylight governed your waking hours, and once the sun set, darkness truly descended. Homes were lit by flickering candles, animal fat lamps, or the embers of a hearth. These sources provided only dim illumination, casting long, dancing shadows. There was no flipping a switch to flood a room with light, no streetlights to guide your way at night. Imagine navigating your home, or even a familiar street in near total darkness, relying on memory and touch. This profound darkness after sunset is a mainstream historical fact, influencing everything from sleep patterns to safety. The understanding of the natural world was vastly different too. Without modern science, explanations for natural phenomena were often found in religion, superstition, or direct observation. Without systematic analysis, crop failures might be attributed to divine displeasure or bad omens, rather than nutrient depletion or pest infestations. Whether patterns were seen as acts of God rather than complex meteorological systems, this worldview, where the line between the natural and the supernatural was often blurred, shaped people's responses to challenges and their understanding of their place in the universe. It fostered a deep respect for, and sometimes fear of, the unpredictable forces of nature. This integrated, often spiritual, view of the natural world is a mainstream historical fact. Even something as simple as counting or calculating was different. While sophisticated mathematics existed in some scholarly circles, for the average person, calculations were often done using tally sticks, abacuses, or simply on their fingers. Large numbers might be difficult to conceptualize. Imagine trying to manage your crops, your payments, or your household inventory without the aid of calculators. or readily available written records. This more tangible and less abstract approach to numbers is a quirky tidbit. Historians still argue about the average level of practical numeracy among different social classes in the Middle Ages. The importance of community and collective effort was paramount. Tasks that we now often do individually, like building a house or harvesting a field, were often communal efforts. Neighbors would help each other, pooling resources and labor. This necessity fostered strong bonds within villages and reinforced the idea of mutual responsibility. Imagine a world where your survival literally depended on the cooperation of those around you, where individualism was far less valued than collective harmony. This deeply communal spirit is a mainstream historical fact. It shows how necessity often shaped social values. The role of monastic orders was incredibly significant, not just spiritually, but also economically and culturally. Monasteries were often large, self-sufficient estates, acting as centers of agricultural innovation, scholarship, and charity. Monks and nuns devoted their lives to prayer and work, contributing to society through farming, brewing, teaching, and caring for the sick. Imagine a life of strict discipline, communal living, and constant devotion, far removed from the bustling world outside their walls. These monastic communities played a crucial role in preserving knowledge and providing social services that no other institutions offered. This widespread influence of monasticism is a mainstream historical fact. A quirky tidbit is that many monasteries were pioneers in the development of sophisticated agricultural techniques, including specialized irrigation systems and selective breeding of livestock, sometimes even surpassing secular farms in their productivity. Historians still argue about the true economic impact of monastic landholdings on the broader medieval economy, and whether their wealth was always used for charitable purposes. The presence of disease was a constant shadow over medieval life. Beyond the major plagues, common ailments like dysentery, smallpox, and tuberculosis were rampant, often proving fatal due to poor sanitation, malnutrition, and the lack of effective medical treatments. Life was precarious, and even a minor injury or infection could quickly turn deadly. Imagine the quiet fear that would permeate everyday existence, knowing that illness could strike anyone at any time, often with no discernible cause or cure. This pervasive vulnerability to disease is a mainstream historical fact, explaining the low life expectancy of the era. The concept of time off or vacations, as we know them, was non-existent for the common person. The rhythm of life was dictated by the agricultural seasons and religious festivals. While religious holidays provided breaks from labor, they were not purely for leisure, but for spiritual observance. The idea of a personal holiday, separate from these established cycles, was not part of the medieval mindset. Imagine a life where your entire existence was geared towards production and survival, with very little distinction between work and personal time. This unrelenting cycle of labor is a mainstream historical fact. Even something as simple as fire was a constant threat. Homes, often made of wood and thatch, were highly flammable, and the use of open hearths for heating and cooking meant that fires were a frequent and devastating occurrence. Entire villages, and even parts of cities, could be wiped out in a single blaze. There were no fire departments, no sophisticated alarm systems. People relied on buckets of water and communal effort to fight fires, often in vain. Imagine the ever-present anxiety of a fire starting in your home or your neighbors, knowing the potential for total destruction. This persistent danger of fire is a quirky tidbit that adds another layer of everyday peril. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of early medieval firefighting measures in urban areas and how quickly communities rebuilt after major conflagrations. The relationship with the land was profoundly intimate. For the peasant, the land was not just a place of work, but the source of all life. Their survival was directly tied to its fertility and generosity. They understood its rhythms, its demands, and its potential in a way that modern people, largely removed from direct agricultural production, rarely do. Imagine feeling that direct, unmediated connection to the earth, your destiny inextricably linked to its bounty or its scarcity. This deep, almost spiritual connection to the land is a mainstream historical fact. It shaped their worldview and their daily rituals. The concept of individual rights or freedoms, as we understand them, was largely absent. People's lives were defined by their obligations to their Lord, their family, and the church. Personal autonomy was limited, and one's place in society was largely fixed at birth. There was little opportunity for social mobility, meaning that if you were born a peasant, you would almost certainly die a peasant. Imagine living in a system where your individual aspirations were secondary to your duties and your predetermined social role. This rigid social structure, while providing a kind of order, severely constrained personal liberty. This lack of individual freedom is a mainstream historical fact. The spiritual life of the average medieval person was deeply personal and constantly present. They lived in a world where God's hand was seen in everything, from a bountiful harvest to a devastating plague. Sin was a real and terrifying concept, and the afterlife, with its stark choices of heaven, hell, or purgatory, was a vivid reality. Pilgrimages to holy sites, though arduous, were common, undertaken to seek divine favor, forgiveness, or miraculous cures. Imagine the profound spiritual weight that would accompany every decision, every action, knowing that your eternal destiny hung in the balance. This pervasive religious devotion is a mainstream historical fact that shaped not just individual lives, but the entire social fabric. A quirky tidbit is the widespread belief in relics, physical remains of saints or objects associated with them, which were thought to possess miraculous powers and were highly venerated. Historians still argue about the extent to which popular piety in the Middle Ages was genuinely devout or driven more by fear of divine punishment. The concept of borders and nations, as we understand them today, was far more fluid. While kingdoms existed, their boundaries often shifted with conquest, marriage, or inheritance. Loyalty was often more to a local lord or a specific region than to a centralized state. There was no strong sense of national identity or patriotism in the modern sense. Imagine a world where your primary allegiance was to the person who controlled the land you lived on, rather than to a flag or a distant capital city. This localized sense of identity is a mainstream historical fact that distinguishes medieval political landscapes from contemporary ones. Even something as simple as counting your age was different. Birth records were rare outside of noble families and monastic institutions, meaning many people wouldn't know their exact birth date or even year. Age was often a more fluid concept, defined by milestones like puberty, marriage, or the ability to perform adult labor. Imagine not knowing your precise age and measuring your life in terms of seasons passed and duties fulfilled rather than specific birthdays. This less precise tracking of personal age is a quirky tidbit that reflects the different priorities and record-keeping capabilities of the era. Historians still argue about the average age of marriage and the practical implications of uncertain birth dates on legal and social matters. The role of markets and fairs was crucial for commerce and social interaction. These events were vibrant, bustling hubs where goods were traded, news was exchanged, and entertainment was found. Merchants from various regions would gather, bringing exotic goods from afar, while local farmers and artisans sold their produce and wares. Imagine the sights, sounds, and smells of a medieval market. The haggling of vendors, the calls of street entertainers, the aroma of roasted meats and fresh bread, all amidst a crowd of people from all walks of life. These markets were not just economic centers, but vital social spaces. This importance of local and regional markets is a mainstream historical fact. The legal system was a complex and often brutal affair, vastly different from modern jurisprudence. Justice was often administered locally by the lord or his representatives, and trials could involve oaths, ordeals like walking over hot coals or plunging a hand into boiling water, with survival indicating innocence or trial by combat. The concept of innocent until proven guilty was far from universal, and torture was sometimes used to extract confessions. Imagine facing a legal system where your fate could depend on enduring a physical ordeal or literally fighting for your innocence. This harsh and often arbitrary system of justice is a mainstream historical fact. The role of public spectacles was significant. executions were often public events, serving as deterrents and forms of grim entertainment. Tournaments, with their jousting and mock battles, were popular, particularly among the nobility, offering displays of martial prowess and chivalry. Religious plays and mystery cycles also drew large crowds, teaching biblical stories to a largely illiterate populace. Imagine a world where public punishment was a common sight, and where the most dramatic entertainment involved knights clashing in a joust. This embrace of public spectacle, for both instruction and entertainment, is a mainstream historical fact. The importance of heraldry cannot be overstated, particularly among the nobility. Coats of arms were not merely decorative. They were vital identifiers on the battlefield, distinguishing friend from foe, and also served as powerful symbols of lineage, honor, and allegiance off the field. Every knight, every noble family had a unique design passed down through generations. Imagine a world where your identity, your family's history, and your loyalty were instantly recognizable through a collection of colors, symbols, and animals on a shield or banner. This intricate system of heraldry is a mainstream historical fact, illustrating the visual language of medieval power and identity. A quirky tidbit is the role of heralds, who were not just messengers, but also experts in coats of arms, responsible for organizing tournaments, proclaiming peace and war, and even identifying fallen knights on the battlefield. Historians still argue about the precise origins of heraldry, and whether its primary function was practical identification in battle or symbolic display of status. Even the concept of time itself was deeply intertwined with the seasons and the agricultural year. Beyond the daily rhythm, the entire year was a cycle of planting, growing, and harvesting. Feasts and festivals were often tied to these agricultural milestones, marking the arrival of spring, the abundance of summer, or the dormancy of winter. Imagine living in a world where your entire life, from your daily chores to your celebrations, was profoundly dictated by the sun's path across the sky and the earth's response. This seasonal dependency is a mainstream historical fact that shaped everything from diet to social gatherings. The role of specific architectural styles, especially Gothic architecture, was a defining characteristic of later medieval Europe. Cathedrals, with their soaring arches, elaborate stained glass windows, and intricate carvings, were not just places of worship, but massive undertakings that required immense resources, skill, and time to build. They were expressions of faith, demonstrations of wealth and power, and often the tallest structures in any city, dominating the skyline. Imagine standing before one of these colossal structures, the sunlight streaming through the colored glass, filling the vast interior with an otherworldly glow. This architectural ambition is a mainstream historical fact, showcasing medieval ingenuity and devotion. A quirky tidbit is the use of gargoyles on these cathedrals. grotesque stone figures that served not only as decorative elements, but also as functional water spouts, directing rainwater away from the building's walls. Historians still argue about the precise engineering techniques used to achieve the immense heights and delicate structures of Gothic cathedrals. Given the limitations of medieval technology, the presence of forests was far more extensive and impactful than in much of modern Europe. Forests were not just sources of timber and fuel, but also places of danger, harboring outlaws and wild animals. They were also crucial for resources like hunting game and foraging for food. Imagine a world where vast, dense forests dominated the landscape, sometimes acting as natural barriers or hidden pathways, always with a sense of the wild and unknown lurking within. This pervasive role of forests in both economy and folklore is a mainstream historical fact. The concept of a journeyman was a crucial stage in medieval crafts. After completing an apprenticeship, a young craftsman would become a journeyman, traveling from town to town, working for different masters to hone their skills and gain experience. This period of travel and varied work was essential before they could hope to become a master craftsman themselves and set up their own shop. Imagine embarking on such a journey, carrying your tools and skills, seeking out work, learning from different masters, all to perfect your craft. This structured path to mastery is a quirky tidbit, highlighting the vocational training of the time. Historians still argue about the typical duration of a journeyman's travel and its overall impact on the diffusion of artistic and technical knowledge across Europe. The importance of the guild system extended beyond just regulating crafts. Guilds also acted as social welfare organizations, providing support for sick or elderly members and looking after the widows and orphans of deceased craftsmen. They fostered a strong sense of community and mutual aid among their members. So, while they controlled who could practice a trade and how, they also provided a vital safety net in a world without formal state welfare. This dual role of guilds is a mainstream historical fact. The prevalence of illiteracy meant that images and symbols held immense power as forms of communication. Stained glass windows, murals, and sculptures in churches weren't just decorative. They were visual Bibles, telling stories from scripture to a populace who couldn't read the texts themselves. Tapestries in noble homes depicted historical events or heroic sagas. Imagine learning your history, your morals, and your faith not from books, but from the vivid imagery all around you. This visual storytelling is a mainstream historical fact, highlighting a different way of transmitting knowledge and culture. A quirky tidbit is the use of emblems in medieval literature and art, where specific animals, plants, or objects consistently carried symbolic meanings, creating a rich visual lexicon understood by many. Historians still argue about the precise literacy rates among different social classes throughout the Middle Ages, and whether the ability to read was more common than previously thought in certain regions. The concept of timekeeping itself was evolving. While sundials and water clocks had existed for centuries, the later Middle Ages saw the development of mechanical clocks. These early clocks, often found in church towers, were public timekeepers, dictating the rhythm of town life, signaling prayer times, market openings, and curfews. Imagine a world slowly transitioning from the natural rhythms of the sun and bells to the more precise, artificial beat of a mechanical clock. This shift in time measurement is a mainstream historical fact, laying the groundwork for the more regimented schedules we live by today. The role of specific types of food and drink went beyond mere sustenance. They held social and symbolic meanings. Bread was the staff of life for all, but the type of bread, coarse rye for peasants, fine white for nobles, clearly demarcated social status. Wine, while drunk by the wealthy, also had profound religious significance. Ale and beer were staple beverages for the common people, often consumed in large quantities due to unsafe water. Imagine the subtle social cues embedded in every meal, every drink, signaling your place in the hierarchy without a single word being spoken. This symbolic and social role of food is a mainstream historical fact. Even the experience of sleep was different. Without modern insulation or heating, homes would have been cold, especially in winter. People often slept communally for warmth, sometimes even with their livestock. Beds, as you heard, were often basic, made of straw or simple wooden frames. The profound darkness after sunset, coupled with the absence of artificial light, would have led to different sleep patterns, perhaps closer to a segmented sleep, with periods of waking during the night. Imagine the chill of the night air, the rustling of straw, and the close presence of others as you tried to find rest. This more communal and perhaps fragmented sleep experience is a quirky tidbit, contrasting with our modern notions of individual, uninterrupted sleep. Historians still argue about the prevalence and implications of biphasic sleep, sleeping in two distinct phases with a period of wakefulness in between. In the Middle Ages, the concept of a town itself was a dynamic and growing entity. As trade revived in the later Middle Ages, towns began to grow, attracting merchants, artisans, and people seeking freedom from feudal obligations. Town charters, granted by lords or kings, often offered greater autonomy and personal liberty than life in a village. These burgeoning urban centers became vibrant hubs of commerce, culture, and new ideas. Imagine the excitement of moving to a town with its new opportunities, its diverse population, and its greater sense of independence compared to the rigid life of the countryside. This rise of urban centers is a mainstream historical fact, signaling a significant shift in medieval society. The widespread use of Latin as the language of scholarship, government, and the church created a linguistic divide. While local vernacular languages were spoken by the common people, Latin was the language of power and learning. This meant that access to legal documents, religious texts, and scholarly works was often restricted to the educated elite. Imagine living in a world where the most important documents and religious ceremonies were conducted in a language you didn't fully understand, emphasizing the power of those who did. This linguistic stratification is a mainstream historical fact. The constant presence of animals, as we've touched upon, was not just about livestock for food or labor. It also meant a different relationship with the wild. Wolves, bears, and other predators were a real threat to livestock, and sometimes even to humans, particularly in rural areas or near dense forests. Hunting, therefore, was not just a sport for the nobility, but a necessary means of protection and food procurement for many. Imagine the subtle tension of living close to truly wild nature, where the sounds of the forest at night carried a deeper, more primal meaning. This intimate and often dangerous relationship with wild animals is a mainstream historical fact. Even the concept of names and identity had a different nuance. Surnames were still evolving, often derived from a person's occupation: baker, miller, smith, their father's name Johnson, Peterson, or their place of origin. Many people would simply be known by their given name and their trade or where they lived. Imagine a world where your identity was more directly linked to your role in society or your immediate surroundings, rather than a more abstract family name. This fluid nature of surnames is a quirky tidbit. Historians still argue about the precise period when hereditary surnames became common practice across different regions of Europe. The importance of oral tradition extended to laws and customs. While written laws existed, especially for significant matters, many everyday rules, social norms, and community expectations were passed down and enforced through unwritten custom and communal understanding. Disputes were often settled through arbitration by the local lord or elders, relying on precedent and communal memory rather than codified legal texts. Imagine a world where the rules governing your life were less about written statutes and more about the collective memory and consensus of your community. This reliance on custom and oral tradition in governance is a mainstream historical fact. The role of specific types of labor and tools would be a stark revelation. For example, the blacksmith was not just a craftsman, but a vital pillar of the community, responsible for creating and repairing almost every metal object, from farm implements to armor. Their forge was a focal point of sound and light in the village. Imagine the rhythmic clang of the hammer on the anvil, the shower of sparks, the smell of hot metal, all sounds and sights that would be an everyday part of medieval life. The simple, robust tools they produced, often requiring immense physical effort to use, tell a story of hard manual labor. This essential role of the blacksmith is a mainstream historical fact. The concept of beauty and personal adornment, particularly for the elite, involved different ideals. For noblewomen, pale skin was highly valued, signaling a life of leisure, untouched by the sun's harsh rays. Elaborate hairstyles, often involving braids and veils, were common. For noblemen, practicality in clothing was often combined with rich fabrics and dyes to display status. Jewelry, when present, was often symbolic or religious in nature. Imagine the subtle and overt ways in which medieval fashion communicated wealth, status, and social values, quite different from the ever-changing trends of our own time. This static yet symbolic approach to beauty is a mainstream historical fact. Even the way time was experienced in terms of natural phenomena was more acute. People were acutely aware of the length of the day, the strength of the sun, and the signs of approaching storms or changes in season. Their survival depended on it. There were no sophisticated weather forecasts or climate control systems. You lived in direct, unmediated relationship with the elements. Imagine relying on the feel of the air, the look of the clouds, or the behavior of animals to predict the weather, with your crops and your very life at stake. This intimate connection to natural indicators is a quirky tidbit. Historians still argue about the degree of accuracy and effectiveness of medieval weather prediction methods. The role of specific occupations, even for seemingly minor ones, was crucial. The miller, for example, who ground grain into flour, held a powerful position in the village, often controlling a vital resource for the community. Their mill, whether water-powered or wind-powered, was a marvel of medieval engineering. Imagine the steady, rhythmic turning of the mill wheel and the rumble of the grinding stones, a constant sound in any village with a stream or wind. This specialized yet vital role of the miller is a mainstream historical fact. The significance of castles extended beyond their defensive capabilities. They were also centers of administration, justice, and social life for the nobility. The lord and his family, along with their retinue of servants, knights, and scribes, lived within the castle walls. It was a self-contained world, a microcosm of the feudal system, with everyone having a specific role and place. Imagine the constant activity within a castle, the training of knights in the courtyard, the bustling kitchens, the quiet work of scribes in the scriptorium, and the formal gatherings in the great hall. This multifunctional role of the castle is a mainstream historical fact, illustrating its central importance to medieval power and society. A quirky tidbit is the guardrobe, a medieval toilet that often emptied directly into the moat or a cesspit, but which some historians also suggest was used to air clothes due to the ammonia in the waste acting as a deodorizer. Historians still argue about the precise living conditions within castles and whether they were as drafty and uncomfortable as popularly imagined. Even the concept of money and exchange was different while coinage existed, especially for larger transactions or among the wealthy. Many everyday exchanges for common people still involved bartering goods and services. A farmer might pay his rent in crops, or a craftsman might exchange his wares for food. Imagine a world where not every transaction involved coins, where the value of goods was often directly tied to their utility and necessity. This prevalence of bartering and in-kind payments is a mainstream historical fact. The presence of disease, particularly widespread epidemics, shaped demography and social structures. The Black Death, which swept through Europe in the mid-14th century, is a chilling example. It killed an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's population, leading to profound social, economic, and cultural changes. Labor became scarce, empowering surviving peasants to demand better conditions and shaking the foundations of the feudal system. Imagine the sheer terror and devastation of such an event, watching loved ones succumb, with no understanding of its cause or how to stop it. This cataclysmic impact of the plague is a mainstream historical fact, a turning point in medieval history. The role of specific agricultural tools and methods was fundamental to survival. The heavy plow, which we briefly mentioned, was a significant innovation, allowing farmers to turn over the heavier, more fertile soils of northern Europe, increasing agricultural output. The three-field system of crop rotation, where land was divided into 3 fields, with one left fallow each year to recover fertility, and the other 2 planted with different crops, was another vital advancement, improving yields and reducing the risk of complete crop failure. Imagine the backbreaking work involved in guiding such a plow, pulled by oxen or horses across vast fields, or the careful planning required to implement a 3-field rotation system. These agricultural innovations are mainstream historical facts, directly contributing to population growth and stability. The concept of chivalry for knights was more than just a code of conduct in battle. It was an ideal that encompassed religious piety, loyalty to one's lord, protection of the weak, and courtly love. While often idealized and not always perfectly adhered to, it provided a moral framework for the warrior class. Imagine living by such a strict, yet often romanticized, code, striving for honor and virtue in a brutal world. This ideal of chivalry is a quirky tidbit that heavily influenced medieval literature and aristocratic culture. Historians still argue about the extent to which knights actually adhered to the ideals of chivalry versus acting out of practical military necessity or self-interest. The importance of the church's influence permeated even daily routines. The ringing of church bells often marked the hours of the day, signaling times for prayer, work, and rest for the entire community. It was a constant reminder of the church's presence and its role in ordering daily life. Imagine the familiar chime of the bells, a constant, comforting, or perhaps insistent sound that structured your day from dawn till dusk. This temporal authority of the church is a mainstream historical fact. The pervasive odor of medieval life, which we've briefly touched on, is perhaps one of the most difficult aspects for us to truly imagine. Without modern sanitation, bathing, or even widespread personal deodorants, the air would have been thick with the smells of human and animal waste, unwashed bodies, smoke from hearths, rotting food, and general grime. Imagine a world where this complex and often offensive bouquet was simply the norm, a constant background to your daily existence. Your modern senses would be overwhelmed, but medieval noses were undoubtedly accustomed to it. This pervasive lack of cleanliness and resulting odor is a mainstream historical fact that profoundly impacted the sensory experience of the era. A quirky tidbit is that the use of strong perfumes and aromatic herbs, particularly among the wealthy, was less about smelling good and more about masking the overwhelming stench of their surroundings and even themselves. Historians still argue about the precise impact of these environmental odors on medieval health and disease transmission. The role of specific types of entertainment, beyond the festivals and stories, also tells a lot about the era. Bear baiting and cockfighting, while brutal, were popular forms of amusement. Falconry was a highly valued skill and a prestigious pastime for the nobility. Even the simple act of playing dice or board games would have been common. Imagine a world where your choices for entertainment were limited and often involved activities that might seem cruel or barbaric to modern sensibilities, but which were perfectly acceptable and even celebrated at the time. This different understanding of acceptable entertainment is a mainstream historical fact. Even the concept of childhood, as you heard, was truncated. Children were not afforded the long, protected period of play and education that we recognize today. From a young age, they were expected to contribute to the household economy, whether through simple chores or more demanding labor in the fields or workshops. Play was often a form of practical learning, preparing them for their future roles. Imagine the gravity of childhood responsibilities, knowing that your contribution was essential to your family's survival, rather than a childhood filled with school and extracurricular activities. This early entry into adult responsibilities is a mainstream historical fact. The pervasive influence of natural cycles extended to everything from light to diet. Without artificial light, people's sleep patterns were likely more segmented, perhaps waking in the middle of the night for a period of activity before returning to sleep. Food was highly seasonal, with fresh produce only available at certain times of the year, leading to diets dominated by preserved goods for much of the winter. Imagine your entire life being orchestrated by the sun and the seasons, a deep, primal connection to the natural world that few of us experience today. This strong dependence on natural cycles is a mainstream historical fact. The role of pilgrimage was a defining feature of medieval religious life. For many, embarking on a long, arduous journey to a holy site like Canterbury or Rome was the ultimate act of piety, a way to seek forgiveness for sins, fulfill a vow, or ask for a miracle. These journeys were dangerous and uncomfortable, but they also offered a rare opportunity for travel, adventure, and meeting people from different walks of life. Imagine the spiritual conviction and physical endurance required for such a journey, walking for weeks or months, relying on the kindness of strangers and the hospitality of monasteries along the way. This profound spiritual motivation for travel is a mainstream historical fact. A quirky tidbit is the creation of pilgrim badges, small, inexpensive souvenirs often made of lead or tin, bought at holy sites and worn on hats or cloaks as proof of the journey. Historians still argue about the true motivations of medieval pilgrims, whether primarily religious devotion, social conformity, or even a desire for adventure. The constant threat of hunger, as previously mentioned, shaped daily decisions. Food scarcity was not an abstract concept, but a tangible, ever-present possibility. Every harvest was a moment of profound significance, determining whether the community would eat well or face starvation in the coming months. Imagine the deep anxiety surrounding the weather and crop yields, knowing that your very survival depended on the whims of nature. This fundamental vulnerability to famine is a mainstream historical fact. The very air you breathed was different. Without modern industrial pollution, the air would have been cleaner in many respects, but also filled with the natural particulate matter from wood fires, animal dung, and unpaved roads. The smell of burning wood would be ever present, particularly in winter. Imagine the difference in air quality, a mix of natural freshness and the constant haze of domestic smoke. This distinct atmospheric composition is a quirky tidbit, affecting both health and visibility. Historians still argue about the precise impact of medieval air pollution from hearths and early industries on respiratory health. The presence of fortifications, even in seemingly peaceful areas, was a constant reminder of the potential for conflict. Small Motte and Bailey castles, watchtowers, or even fortified manor houses dotted the landscape, serving as refuges in times of trouble. They weren't just for defense against large armies, but also against local bandits or rival lords. Imagine the reassuring sight of a fortified structure in the distance, a symbol of protection in an often unpredictable world. This widespread network of smaller fortifications is a mainstream historical fact, illustrating the pervasive need for local defense. Even the concept of hygiene for food preparation was vastly different without refrigeration or modern understanding of bacteria. Food spoilage was common. Meats were often heavily salted, smoked, or spiced to mask the taste of decomposition. Cooking methods involved open fires, and kitchens, even in noble households, lacked the rigorous cleanliness standards we expect today. Imagine the constant risk of foodborne illness, where every meal carried a hidden danger, and the flavors were often dominated by the efforts to preserve rather than enhance. This fundamental lack of food hygiene is a mainstream historical fact, contributing to prevalent diseases. The role of specific types of knowledge, often passed down orally, was crucial for everyday survival. Knowledge of herbs for medicinal purposes, understanding of animal behavior for farming, and traditional methods for predicting weather were all vital skills. This practical, experiential knowledge was far more important than formal academic learning for the average person. Imagine relying on generations of accumulated wisdom about the natural world to ensure your family's survival, rather than consulting scientific textbooks or online databases. This reliance on practical, inherited knowledge is a mainstream historical fact. The concept of time for the common person was more fluid and less precise than our modern clock-driven lives. While church bells marked the canonical hours for prayer, daily tasks were often governed by the sun's position and the demands of the seasons. There was no need to be on time for an appointment down to the minute. Imagine a life where your schedule was dictated by natural light and the needs of your animals and crops, rather than a rigid timetable. This more organic approach to time management is a quirky tidbit. Historians still argue about the extent to which mechanical clocks, once introduced, fundamentally altered the daily routines of the common populace. The importance of land ownership was absolute. For nobles, it meant power, wealth, and status. For peasants, it meant access to the means of survival, even if they didn't own the land outright. Disputes over land boundaries, inheritance, and rights were common, and could lead to bitter feuds or even warfare. Imagine a world where every inch of land was valued, and your very existence was tied to its control or use. This fundamental importance of land is a mainstream historical fact, driving much of medieval conflict and social structure. Even the experience of color would be different, as previously mentioned. The colors available for dyeing fabrics were limited by natural sources, leading to a palette that was largely earthy and subdued for the common person. Bright, vibrant colors were rare and expensive, reserved for the wealthy and powerful. Imagine the world in tones of brown, green, and undyed linen, with splashes of red or blue standing out vividly as symbols of luxury. This limited and symbolic use of color is a mainstream historical fact that adds to the visual tapestry of the era. The medieval understanding of disease, as you've heard, was largely based on the theory of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Illness was thought to be caused by an imbalance of these humors, and treatments like bloodletting or purging were designed to restore balance. This often meant that remedies were ineffective or even harmful. A grim, mainstream historical fact. Imagine the helplessness of falling ill, relying on remedies that seem nonsensical to our modern understanding, with no concept of germs or infections. This fundamentally different medical paradigm highlights the fragility of life. A quirky tidbit is the widespread belief in the medicinal properties of various, sometimes bizarre, concoctions, such as powdered mummified remains or specific animal parts, all thought to cure ailments. Historians still argue about the true effectiveness of some traditional herbal remedies used in the Middle Ages, acknowledging that some may have had genuine therapeutic value despite the flawed underlying medical theories. The role of specific types of literature and storytelling was profound. Epic poems such as Beowulf or the Song of Roland recounted heroic deeds and defined cultural values. Romances featuring knights, ladies, and chivalrous adventures gained popularity in the later Middle Ages. Fables and allegories often conveyed moral lessons. For a largely illiterate population, these stories were not just entertainment, but crucial means of transmitting cultural knowledge, history, and ethical codes. Imagine gathering around a fire, listening intently as a storyteller recites a long, winding epic, your imagination painting the scenes, absorbing the lessons. This centrality of oral and recited literature is a mainstream historical fact. Even the concept of warfare involved different ethical considerations. While brutal, there was also a developing concept of just war theory, debated by theologians and philosophers, which sought to define when it was morally permissible to engage in conflict. Rules of engagement, however rudimentary, sometimes applied to specific circumstances, such as the treatment of non-combatants or prisoners, though these were frequently violated. Imagine the philosophical debates occurring in scholarly circles about the ethics of killing and conquest, even as bloody battles raged outside castle walls. This evolving thought on warfare is a quirky tidbit. Historians still argue about the practical impact of just war theory on actual military conduct in the medieval period. The importance of the family unit was paramount for survival and social structure. The extended family, including grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins, often lived in close proximity and provided a crucial network of support. Marriage was not just about individual affection, but about alliances between families, ensuring continuity of labor, land, or status. Imagine a world where your individual identity was deeply interwoven with your family, where your responsibilities and fortunes were inextricably linked to theirs. This strong emphasis on kinship and lineage is a mainstream historical fact. The presence of specific types of religious architecture, like Romanesque churches, was distinct from the later Gothic style. Romanesque churches, prevalent in the earlier Middle Ages, were characterized by their massive, thick walls, rounded arches, and relatively small windows, giving them a heavy, fortress-like appearance. They were often dark inside, but offered a sense of immense solidity and permanence. Imagine entering one of these ancient stone structures. The cool, damp air, the echoing silence, the sense of being enclosed by centuries of faith and history. This distinct architectural style is a mainstream historical fact, marking a specific period of medieval building. The challenges of urban life for those who lived in towns were significant, while towns offered opportunities and relative freedom compared to rural serfdom. They were also crowded, unsanitary, and prone to fire and disease. Streets were narrow and unpaved, often filled with refuse. Water sources could be contaminated, and the close quarters facilitated the rapid spread of illness. Imagine the noise, the smells, the constant press of people in a medieval town, a vibrant but often unhealthy environment. This mixture of opportunity and hardship in urban centers is a mainstream historical fact. The very concept of time, beyond the daily and seasonal cycles, was also deeply spiritual. Major events like births, deaths, and marriages were often marked by religious rituals and blessings, emphasizing their sacred nature. The passage of years was counted through significant historical or biblical events, rather than a continuous, linear progression of dates. Imagine living in a world where time itself felt less like a ticking clock and more like a tapestry woven with spiritual meaning and communal memory. This spiritual understanding of time is a mainstream historical fact. A quirky tidbit is the medieval belief in the great chain of being, a hierarchical order that placed everything in the universe, from God down to the lowest creature, in its proper place, reinforcing a sense of cosmic order and divine purpose in the passage of time. Historians still argue about how much the common person understood or consciously adhered to complex theological concepts like the great chain of being. The presence of domestic animals within the home was a common reality, particularly for peasants. Livestock like chickens, pigs, or even a cow might share living spaces, providing warmth, food, and companionship. This close proximity to animals meant constant sounds, smells, and challenges, but also a vital source of survival and a deeper connection to the cycles of nature. Imagine sharing your living space with animals, their presence an integral part of your daily routine, from their morning calls to their evening settling. This intimate cohabitation with farm animals is a mainstream historical fact, highlighting the multi-purpose nature of medieval dwellings. The role of specific types of craft, such as manuscript illumination, showcases the artistic and intellectual endeavors of the era. Monks and scribes meticulously copied texts by hand, often adorning them with intricate illustrations, vibrant colors, and gold leaf. These illuminated manuscripts were not just books, but works of art, highly prized and often commissioned by the wealthy or the church. Imagine the painstaking precision and artistic skill required to create a single page, the hours spent carefully drawing, painting, and applying precious metals. This dedication to manuscript art is a quirky tidbit, revealing a different form of artistic expression. Historians still argue about the precise techniques used by medieval illuminators to achieve such vibrant colors and intricate details, particularly given the limitations of their pigments and tools. The importance of the Crusades, a series of religious wars undertaken by European Christians to reclaim the Holy Land from Muslim rule, profoundly impacted medieval Europe. They led to significant cultural exchange, bringing new ideas, goods, and technologies from the Middle East to the West. They also fueled religious fervor, led to immense loss of life, and shaped political relationships for centuries. Imagine the vast movements of people, the clashes of cultures, and the religious zeal that characterized these epic undertakings, transforming the lives of countless individuals. This series of religious conflicts is a mainstream historical fact that reshaped the geopolitical landscape. The very concept of health was interpreted differently. It wasn't just the absence of disease, but a holistic state influenced by environmental factors, diet, and spiritual well-being. People often sought remedies from both traditional healers and religious figures, blurring the lines between medicine and faith. Imagine a world where your well-being was seen as a complex interplay of physical, spiritual, and environmental forces, with remedies often involving prayers, charms, and herbal concoctions. This broader understanding of health is a mainstream historical fact. The role of specific types of social gatherings, like the communal feast, was crucial for reinforcing social bonds and celebrating important occasions. Whether a simple village feast after a harvest or a grand celebration in a noble's hall, these events were opportunities for people to come together, share food and drink, and enjoy entertainment. They often served to reaffirm social hierarchies while simultaneously fostering a sense of community. Imagine the laughter, the music, the shared plates of food, all bringing people together in a world where daily life could be isolating. This function of communal feasting is a mainstream historical fact. The pervasive presence of death was a constant in medieval life, more so than in our modern era of extended lifespans and advanced medicine. Infant mortality was incredibly high, as we discussed, and adults often succumbed to diseases that are easily curable today. Death was not a distant abstraction, but a frequent, intimate visitor deeply impacting families and communities. Funerals were significant communal events, often followed by wakes that could last for days, emphasizing the collective nature of grief and remembrance. Imagine living in a world where the specter of death was ever present, where you would likely witness the passing of many loved ones throughout your life, and where the rituals surrounding death were deeply ingrained in your community's fabric. This heightened awareness of mortality is a mainstream historical fact that shaped medieval perspectives on life and religion. A quirky tidbit is the concept of memento mori, Latin for remember you must die, which was a common artistic and philosophical theme in the Middle Ages, appearing in everything from illuminated manuscripts to tomb sculptures, reminding people of the transient nature of earthly life. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of such high mortality rates on the collective medieval psyche. The role of specific types of entertainment, beyond the festivals and stories, was often less about individual consumption and more about communal participation. Folk dances, often tied to seasonal celebrations, were a common activity, bringing people together in joyful movement. Games of skill and chance, like dice or early forms of chess, provided intellectual stimulation. Imagine joining in a lively communal dance in the village square, feeling the rhythm and camaraderie, a simple yet profound joy shared by many. This collective nature of entertainment is a mainstream historical fact. Even the concept of time for daily activities was much more flexible. While agricultural tasks had their seasons, and monastic life had its fixed hours of prayer, for many, the rhythm of the day was less about minutes and more about completing tasks. There was no rush hour or pressure to meet precise deadlines in the same way we experience them. Imagine a slower, more deliberate pace to your day, where tasks were completed when they were completed, rather than by a strict clock. This less rigid temporal structure is a quirky tidbit. Historians still argue about the level of discipline and punctuality expected in different medieval occupations and social strata. The importance of the church's calendar permeated every aspect of daily and yearly life. Not only did it dictate religious observances, but it also influenced economic activities, with certain days being forbidden for work and others designated for markets or fairs. The cycle of feast days and fasts directly impacted diet and celebration. Imagine your entire year being structured by a powerful religious calendar, influencing what you ate, what you wore, and how you spent your time. This pervasive influence of the ecclesiastical calendar is a mainstream historical fact. The role of specific types of clothing, beyond practicality and status, also carried symbolic meaning. Colors, as you heard, were significant. Certain garments might be associated with specific professions or religious orders. The act of dressing was not just about covering the body, but about expressing identity, status, and adherence to social norms. Imagine the subtle language of clothing, where every stitch and every dye had a deeper message, understood by those around you. This symbolic use of attire is a mainstream historical fact. The pervasive presence of animals, as you know, extended to their use in warfare. Horses were crucial for cavalry, providing speed and impact on the battlefield. Dogs were sometimes used as guard animals, or even in combat. This integration of animals into military strategy and daily life underscores their vital role in medieval society. Imagine the thundering hooves of a cavalry charge, or the disciplined snarl of war hounds, a testament to the animal-human partnership in both peace and conflict. This military use of animals is a mainstream historical fact. The development of specialized roles within society became more pronounced as the Middle Ages progressed. While most people were peasants, the growth of towns and crafts led to a greater diversity of occupations. Not just blacksmiths and millers, but also bakers, shoemakers, scribes, lawyers, and doctors. This increasing specialization, while still rudimentary by modern standards, marked a gradual shift from a purely agrarian society towards more complex social and economic structures. Imagine a world where your daily interactions involved a broader range of skilled individuals, each contributing to the fabric of medieval life in their unique way. This rise of occupational specialization is a mainstream historical fact. A quirky tidbit is the existence of criers, individuals whose job was to walk through towns and villages, loudly proclaiming news, announcements, and advertisements, essentially serving as living newspapers in a largely illiterate society. Historians still argue about the precise impact of increasing specialization on social mobility and the rigidity of the feudal class system. The importance of pilgrimages extended beyond individual spiritual journeys. They also stimulated local economies along pilgrim routes, fostering the growth of inns, markets, and chapels that catered to the needs of travelers. They served as important cultural conduits, facilitating the exchange of ideas, art, and even scientific knowledge between different regions. Imagine the constant flow of pilgrims on the roads, their footsteps weaving a network of religious and economic connections across medieval Europe. This dual spiritual and economic role of pilgrimages is a mainstream historical fact. Even the concept of warfare involved specific rituals and expectations. Before a major battle, there might be heralds delivering challenges, or elaborate parades of armed forces displaying their might. The act of surrendering or taking prisoners often followed certain unwritten rules, at least among the nobility, driven by the code of chivalry and the potential for ransom. Imagine the formal dance of war, even amidst its brutality, with specific protocols and expectations guiding the actions of the combatants. This ritualized aspect of medieval warfare is a quirky tidbit. Historians still argue about how consistently these rituals were observed, particularly during periods of intense conflict or vengeance. The role of specific types of food preparation and preservation reflected the available technology and the need to make the most of every resource. Smoking and salting meat were essential for winter survival, leading to a diet heavy in preserved goods. Brewing ale and beer was not just for enjoyment, but also a critical way to make water safe to drink. Bread, the staple, was often baked communally in village ovens. Imagine the pervasive smell of wood smoke, yeast, and baking. Bread in medieval communities, daily reminders of the struggle and ingenuity involved in feeding a population. This reliance on traditional preservation and communal cooking methods is a mainstream historical fact. The pervasive presence of disease meant that certain folk remedies and beliefs about health were widespread. Charms, amulets, and prayers were often used alongside, or even instead of, what passed for medical treatment. People might wear specific herbs to ward off illness or visit shrines to seek miraculous cures. Imagine the blend of desperation, faith, and traditional wisdom that characterized the medieval approach to sickness, a time before scientific understanding provided clearer answers. This blend of superstition and traditional healing is a mainstream historical fact. The importance of education, though limited, was concentrated in specific areas. Monastic schools taught Latin, theology, and philosophy, preserving ancient knowledge. Cathedral schools served a broader purpose, educating future clergy, and sometimes even lay administrators. The emerging universities offered higher learning in specialized fields. Imagine the rare privilege of receiving formal education and the profound impact it would have on your understanding of the world, setting you apart from the vast majority. This concentrated nature of formal learning is a mainstream historical fact. The presence of specific types of public works, while not as grand as Roman aqueducts, were vital for medieval communities. Town walls provided defense and defined urban spaces. Bridges, though often rudimentary, facilitated trade and communication across rivers. Wells and conduits, though susceptible to contamination, were essential for water supply. These communal infrastructure projects, often built through collective labor, demonstrated a capacity for organization and shared effort. Imagine the sense of security provided by sturdy town walls, or the relief of finding a well for fresh water after a long journey. This communal investment in public works is a mainstream historical fact. A quirky tidbit is the development of early clock towers in towns, which were not just for timekeeping, but also often incorporated bells that would signal fires, curfews, or important announcements. Serving as a vital communication system, historians still argue about the precise methods of financing and organizing these public works, and whether they were primarily driven by feudal lords, urban guilds, or communal initiatives. The role of specific types of social groups beyond the standard hierarchy also contributed to the complexity of medieval life. Wandering minstrels and performers traveled from place to place, bringing news, stories, and entertainment. Hermits and anchorites lived lives of solitary devotion, sometimes sought out for their spiritual wisdom. Beggars and outcasts, too, were a visible part of the social landscape, challenging the neat categories of the feudal system. Imagine encountering these diverse figures on your travels or in your town, each with their own story and their own place outside the conventional social order. This presence of diverse, often marginalized social groups is a mainstream historical fact. Even the concept of personal property was different. While nobles owned vast estates and peasants had their simple tools and household goods, the idea of individual ownership was often intertwined with communal rights and obligations. For instance, peasants might have individual strips of land within larger communal fields, and common lands were used by all for grazing animals or collecting firewood. Imagine a world where your individual possessions were part of a larger communal system, and where collective rights sometimes outweighed individual ones. This blended approach to property is a quirky tidbit. Historians still argue about the exact balance between individual and communal land rights within the manorial system. The importance of the church's vast network of institutions, from grand cathedrals to small parish churches, made it the central organizing force in society. Beyond spiritual guidance, the church often served as the primary provider of education, healthcare, and welfare for the poor. It held immense moral and sometimes legal authority, influencing everything from marriage customs to political decisions. Imagine the church as a ubiquitous presence, its buildings dominating the landscape, its teachings guiding daily life, its institutions providing a safety net in a harsh world. This extensive institutional reach of the church is a mainstream historical fact. The role of specific types of agricultural produce was fundamental. Grains, especially wheat, barley, and oats, formed the bedrock of the medieval diet, consumed as bread, pottage, and ale. Legumes like peas and beans provided essential protein. Vegetables, often grown in small garden plots, supplemented the diet. This limited but vital range of staple crops meant that agricultural success was literally a matter of life or death for most. Imagine your daily meals consisting primarily of various forms of grain, the taste and texture becoming intimately familiar. This reliance on a few core agricultural products is a mainstream historical fact. The pervasive presence of forests and wilderness meant that hunting and foraging were still important skills, even for peasant communities. While the nobility held exclusive hunting rights for large game, commoners often supplemented their diets by snaring small animals, collecting nuts, berries, berries, and mushrooms from communal woods. Imagine the knowledge required to navigate the wild, to identify edible plants, and to track small game, skills that were crucial for supplementing a meager diet. This continued reliance on hunting and foraging is a mainstream historical fact. Now, as the last echoes of our medieval journey fade, and the flickering candlelight of those distant ages slowly dims, let your eyelids grow heavy. Feel the soft comfort of your own bed, the warmth that surrounds you, the quiet hum of your modern world. The harshness of history, with its ancient smells and its relentless struggles, can now recede, becoming just a whisper in the past. Your mind, having wandered through the wattle and daub houses, the muddy streets, and the towering castles, can now gently return to the present, safe in the knowledge of all the progress, all the little comforts we so often take for granted. Allow the stories to dissolve into dreams, the echoes of distant bells and ancient songs to lull you into a peaceful slumber. Rest now, truly rest, for you have survived a day, or rather, the imagining of a day that most would not. Let the quiet darkness be a friend, not a foe, and let peaceful thoughts fill your mind. End of script. Sweet dreams. End of script. Sweet dreams.